Okay. So we're going to get started. As people join, I'll just be trying to keep an eye on the waiting room. Welcome, everyone. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the December Literary Modiin author event. Before I introduce today's authors, I'll just take a minute to tell you about Literary Modiin. For those of you who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel in between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and it's near the airport. And one of our claims to fame is that we're the home of the Maccabees. So Hanukkah coming up this week. I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah. And also please come and visit us next time you're in Israel. We have a large population of English speakers here. So about 1.5 years ago, right after my book came out, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers we have here in Modiin. I know there's at least 3 or 4 different Modiin-based book clubs here tonight, joining us tonight. So, and one from remote in Jerusalem. So welcome, everybody. We had several in-person events with authors before the pandemic hit. And then once the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and have attendees from all over the world, which is great. One of the silver linings of the pandemic. You can see, sorry, to my left, some of the books of authors we've hosted, and some of you are here tonight. So I just want to call out and welcome Erica Dreyfus, Ariel Mazes, Janice Weitzman, Gila Green, Sandel Morse. So please check out their books as well. The format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. And since we have a very large group in attendance today, everybody's muted, but you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just put that in the chat to me. We're also broadcasting this on Facebook Live through Literary Modiin. So if you're in that group, feel free to start a watch party. That's it for my intro. So first, I'd like to introduce Max Gross. He is the son of 2 writers. He grew up in Brooklyn Heights and attended St. Anne's School and Dartmouth College. After school, he spent a year living in Israel before returning to New York, where he worked at the Forward and later at the New York Post. While at the Post, he wrote an article on about what it's like to look like Seth Rogen. That was then turned into a book called From Schlub to Stud, How to Embrace Your Inner Mensch and Conquer the Big City. So this, The Lost Shtetl is actually not Max's first book, but it's his first novel. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the real estate publication Commercial Observer, and he lives on the Upper West Side with his wife, Jane, and their son, Harry. The Lost Shtetl is his first novel. So Max, take it away.
Thank you so much. I should make one small correction. Since the pandemic, we moved to Queens where we could have a backyard, et cetera. But up until this year, I was an Upper West Sider. Hello to everybody. I'm going to read a little bit from my book, The Lost Shtetl. But I just wanted to start by saying how excited I am to do an event in Israel. After college, I spent a year in Arad, as Julie mentioned, and it was a very impactful, formative year for me. When I came back, my first job in journalism was at the Forward newspaper, which I'm sure a lot of you know as the English language sister publication of the Yiddish Vorwitz. While I was there, I had what I like to call the freak beat. I was essentially their color reporter. I would stumble upon a website called Jews for Allah, which was essentially an attempt to do what Moshe Rosen did when he started Jews for Jesus in the 1970s. And I went out to Bethel, Connecticut for the afternoon and listened to this founder's spiel. And I should probably note that while Moshe Rosen did have Jewish parents, the founder of Jews for Allah was not in any way Jewish. And when I asked him how steeped he was in Jewish literature, he told me, well, I read the New York Times every day. Very hospitable guy, though. And I did stories about the invention of the flagel, the flat bagel, Aguna protests, Mel Brooks, competitive gefilte fish eating contests in Sheepshead Bay, Dybbuk haunted wine cabinet that was being auctioned off on eBay. But I did one story that was one of the more popular ones about New Square, New York. And maybe it was a Purim prank or who knows what. But one day in a fish market up there, supposedly, a carp looked up and started talking in Hebrew to the guy who was about to fillet him. And the carp claimed that he was the transmogrified soul of a departed Hasid who was known in the town, and then jumped into a pile of other fish before it could be isolated and interrogated more fully. And I remember getting off the bus in New Square and feeling like I had stepped into a strange replanted shtetl. It wasn't straw roofs and dirt roads, but if you wanted to live the shtetl life in upstate New York with modern architecture and infrastructure and an SUV instead of a horse and cart, this would be it. There was literally a flock of geese passing me as I walked across the street. When I did that story, for some reason, I decided that I should wear a yarmulke while I was up there to better fit in and be trusted. I didn't know there's an old rule of journalism from Tom Wolfe that you should wear a dapper white suit, so you should not fit in. That way people explain things better to you. And I did not know that rule at the time because it was still completely obvious that I was a stranger and I was treated extremely skeptically. This was in the days before smartphones, so I just sort of had to ask around, where was the fish market? And nobody was interested in helping me. Everybody who spoke to me did so in little one-word answers. This was a good 17 years ago, but I still remember the face of one of the women who just stared at me without response when I'd asked her if she'd heard the story of the talking fish. And I remember thinking something similar visiting some of the Hasidic neighborhoods of Brooklyn, like Borough Park. These are isolated little shtetls, just incorporated into the city of New York and the subway system by accident almost. And to a certain extent, it was these kinds of shtetls that were in my thinking when I began constructing the town of Kreskel in my book, The Lost Shtetl. A long time ago, I remember reading a passage from Saul Bellows' book, To Jerusalem and Back, where he's traveling on an airplane next to a young Hasidic guy and has to explain to him what a mathematician is and who Albert Einstein is, which I will admit to those who have already read my book, I ripped off a little bit when Yankel is asked by the doctors in the mental hospital if he knows who Shakespeare's Hamlet is, and he says, Hamlet who? But neither here nor there. It's the kind of thing that seemed impossible in 1976 when the book was published, and seems doubly more so today. And to be honest, I'm not sure whether that's credible or not. I have the feeling it cuts both ways. I know a lot of people who left Hasidism who told me just how shunned American life was, modern life in general was. Their first language is still Yiddish. Their birthday is the 2nd of Kislev, not November 18th. They did not own a television or a computer. But on the other hand, plenty of them do. Pre-pandemic, I would go to some of Brooklyn's varied underground poker rooms, and once the sun was down on Saturday night, I would see Hasidim there. I've known plenty of people who left that life because they were seduced by something else that was on display in modern life. And those were some of the themes I was writing about in The Lost Shtetl. My book is about a little village of Jews in a lonely corner of Poland that is so isolated and hermetic that it's overlooked in the Holocaust and the Cold War and the democratic transition until we stumble on them in the here and now. And to a certain extent, The Lost Shtetl is a time travel book. It's about a village from the past that steps into the present after all the unimaginable tumult and change of the 20th century, something that's utterly baffling to the villagers. But I also think it's a work about alienation and the battle between the acceptance of modernity and technology and its rejection. I very much believe that a lot of us, Jews and Gentiles alike, live a very cloistered life. Some of that was greatly heightened and enhanced because of the pandemic. I'm not certain how isolation is changing us as a culture, probably in subtler ways than we know right now, but I think isolation is one of the great questions about life in 2020. Every single one of us right now is sitting in front of a piece of steel and silicon and plastic and bauxite. And this has done two things. I believe it has made life possible during the pandemic. Millions and millions of people were able to work from home because they could get on a Zoom and send their work in over the computer. And there's no doubt that that saved millions of lives worldwide. We could order food online rather than go to the market, and that saved countless lives. And we had Netflix, something to keep us distracted these many months, and that preserved a certain amount of sanity. And yet I've been highly ambivalent, sometimes disgusted with the obsession that we have with technology. Well, prior to the pandemic, I'd go out to dinner and see four people sitting at a table, supposedly sharing a meal together, each with their nose in their phone. How is that not isolating? It almost feels as if people are hypnotized by these little devices. And I list myself in that indictment. I have a 5-year-old son. These are the most precious, poetic years of his life. And I choose to spend them gritting my teeth because of something idiotic on Twitter. I noticed, by the way, that Nicole Krauss does not have a Twitter, and I salute her for that. So the time I spend with these devices makes me anxious, it makes me depressed, and I found that I'm far happier when I'm not online and worrying about the immediacy of every last thing. And this is something that I'm also writing about in the Lost Shtetl. I think there's no right answer for this. I think that there are real advantages and disadvantages, but I don't really think we've examined them in depth as a culture. So broadly speaking, that's what I was trying to write about in my book. More specifically, though, there is this little town of Kreskul. It's been there for hundreds of years, and the novel begins with an acrimonious divorce between Pesha Lindauer and her husband Ishmael. One of them goes missing from town, and then the other one goes missing. And the rabbis feel that they have to elevate this to the Gentiles, so they sent out this mamzer, orphan, Yankel Lewenkopf, who's the hero of the story, to the nearest city. And when Yankel gets there, he starts talking about his little shtetl in the forest. And not only does nobody believe him, but they stick him in a mental hospital. Eventually, they figure out that Yankel is telling the truth and decide that they have to find Kreskul and reintegrate it into contemporary Poland. And this is the passage that I'm going to read. It's not too long a passage now. And one thing you should probably know before I start the reading is that this is a little bit of a flashback. We saw the discovery of the town in the first chapter. And when the villagers of Kreskul see a helicopter land in town, they think it's got to be the Messiah coming down from heaven. So I'm going to start this passage in 1 second. Just let me find that. Dr. Babiak took it upon herself to make the first call to the governor and felt silly explaining to the administrator who answered the phone. There's a secret shtetl filled with Jews which survived the war, Dr. Babiak said when she was asked what the call was about. There's no danger as far as we know. They're living just as they always did, but we thought we should tell somebody about it. The other line was silent for several moments before the secretary spoke. What's a shtetl? And while the hospital spent months dithering to and fro, the wheels of government moved surprisingly rapidly. Several deputies called back, and the governor himself got on the phone a few hours later. He apparently believed that this little village had the potential to become a big media story, a modern-day Brigadoon, if you will, and everyone should be prepared. An elderly Yiddish translator was summoned from Warsaw, and several government officials descended on Our Lady of Mercy Hospital to interview the various parties involved. When they were satisfied that no hoaxes were being pulled, it was agreed that the government had a duty to visit Kreskul and welcome it to its rightful place in contemporary Polish society. The only thing left to do is actually locate Kreskul, said Raymond Sikorsky, the slight, middle-aged official the voivodeship had sent to Our Lady of Mercy. We will take a helicopter over the forest tomorrow. The helicopter took off from the outskirts of town and landed in the center of Kreskel the next day. And Yankel, who had left the town as an expendable, acceptable loss in the course of finding the truly important people, was suddenly thrust into a heretofore unimaginable position of authority and wisdom. The people of Kreskel had gathered in a crowd the size of which Yankel had never seen before. They stared in stupefaction. They wept. And for the moment, Yankel was as puzzled as the Gentiles. Then he heard one of the townspeople look at the translator and cry, "Moshiach." Throngs followed suit, shouting, "Moshiach, Moshiach, Moshiach," over and over. For not the first time since he had left his home months earlier, he realized just how simple and artless the people he left behind were, the poor souls. Of course, 3 months ago, Yankel would have no doubt had the same reaction. "What is going on here?" the rabbi asked. "Is this the Messiah?" And Yankel began to explain what I recounted a few chapters earlier. After the initial shock had worn off somewhat, it was decided that the succeeding business should be conducted in a less public setting. "Who are these people?" Rabbi Sokolow asked Yankel after the trio had been trotted into his study and examined by the old and esteemed of Kreskel. The younger and less educated were crammed into Rabbi Sokolow's hallway, each with their ears pointed to the rabbi's oak door, eager to hear the miraculous news for themselves. "This man is Raymond Sikorsky," Yankel said, introducing the short, bespectacled Gentile with the receding hairline who carried with him the aura of leadership. "He's with the Voivodeship." "And who is he?" Rabbi Sokolow asked, pointing to the aged, shrunken Jew who had jumped out of the chariot with the Gentile. "His name is Jared something," Yankel replied. "He's here to translate." Rabbi Sokolow looked as if he was trying to weigh his words before he spoke, anxious not to offend anyone's sensibilities, particularly one who might have the imprimatur of holiness. "So he's not the Messiah?" Rabbi Sokolow asked. The translator chuckled softly to himself. "No, I'm not anybody important," he ventured in Yiddish. A more worldly observer would place his accent in Riga. He then gestured to the Gentile chieftain. "He's the important one," which were largely the last words he would speak for himself. "Good people of Kreskel," the translator said a few moments later for the chieftain, "I'm here to fill you in on everything you might have missed. Yes, we missed a lot. I have sometimes lost track of what Sikorsky told us that afternoon and what we learned later over the next few months, but the fundamentals of the last century were recounted. World War II, the Cold War, the creation of the State of Israel, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, a man on the moon, the eradication of polio, the instant coffee powder, even if normal coffee was an unfamiliar commodity in these parts. When Sikorsky spoke about World War II, he was determined that we would not be left with the same doubts as Yankel Lewinkov. He produced 11 photographs, which he placed on the rabbi's wooden desk for each man to examine for himself. "Millions died," the Gentile explained, pointing to the glossy black and white images of Babi Yar, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. "Poland was almost completely cleansed of Jews." As he said the word "cleansed," the Gentile's face changed color, as if he had accidentally said something impolite. And that's all I wrote. That's not all I wrote, but that's all I wrote for today.
That's great. That is great. Thank you, Max. Yeah, everybody can do the little applause button in their Zoom if you want. And if you have any questions for Max as he read, again, put them in the chat. And when Nicole is done reading, we'll go through all the questions for both of them. So thank you very much, Max. That was great. I was telling him before that I listened to the audio version and it was also great. So if you're an audiobook lover, you might want to try the Lost Shtetl in audio version. Okay. Now I'd like to introduce Nicole Krauss. Nicole is the author of the international bestsellers Forest Dark, Great House, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Orange Prize, and The History of Love, which won the Soroyan Prize for International Literature, and France's Prix du Miller. I'm not going to say this right. Livre, whatever. Okay, I can't get the French right, but a big prize in France. I deleted the sentence about your first book, which is called
Man Walks to the Room.
Right, Man Walks into the Room, which I read a long time ago. Her fiction has been published in the New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, Esquire, and the Best American Short Stories, and her books have been translated into 37 languages. She is currently the first writer in residence at the Zuckerman Mind Brain Behavior Institute at Columbia University, which I want to ask you afterwards what that is. To Be a Man is her first collection of short stories, and it was published in November 2020. So, thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. So happy to be here. I want to ask you questions because I'm curious where everybody is, whether most people are in Israel or abroad, but I'm talking to you from Brooklyn, and I see some people have wine. It's too early here for wine. So I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about this collection of short stories and how I came to write it. But unlike a novel where there's a whole arc and ideas that I could present to you as a whole, obviously a collection of stories has many, many, many different facets. So I'll try to touch on a few of them, but what I really hope is that you guys will all have questions and we can leave a lot of time for those. And Max, I just wanted to say about that opening scene into Jerusalem and Back, the Bellow book, the part of it that I always remember that seems unforgettable to me is the fact that the religious person guy next to him, the Hasid next to him, keeps trying to convince him not to eat his non-kosher meal. And so
offers him $15 a week for the rest of his life.
Offers him 15 exactly. I don't know if you guys can see, you probably can't, but behind me, there's a black and white photograph of Bellow, and that actually used to belong to Philip Roth, and it came down to me. It's a terrible picture of him. It's a horrendous picture, but with a great legacy. So it's nice to hear him mentioned. I feel like he's one of the angels and sort of around in my mind when I'm writing always. For those of you who might not know, I have spent the last 18 years, 20 years, I guess, writing novels rather than short stories, and this is a first for me. Although the stories in this book, To Be a Man, were written mostly over the last 8 years, so kind of before my last novel, Forest Dark, and then after I finished it. There's an exception. There's one story that I wrote right after 9/11, which is also right after I happened to write that first novel that you mentioned, Julie. And that story is called Future Emergencies. And it was very strange to go back to it and include it in the book for all kinds of reasons, but it became even stranger after the book was finished and I already given it to the publisher, because in that story, it takes place in New York, and everybody has been asked to wear gas masks, and nobody knows why. There's something that's been perhaps released into the atmosphere. And it's really a story about a relationship between a younger woman and her older boyfriend, who's an historian, and in a sense, whether or not she should leave him. But it takes place in the context of this New York where everyone is walking around in a state of anxiety and fear and masked. And so there was the strangeness of returning to that story, I guess, 18 years later, more 19, and finding it strangely a future emergency still ongoing, as it were. I started my writing life young, as most writers do, and I wanted to be a poet. And that went on for about 10 years until I was 25. And then I had the good sense to figure out that it might be hard to live as a poet, and that I might want to try a slightly easier way. And so, and there were various other reasons. I had felt like I no longer had access to the kind of freedom that I so loved in writing in my poems. I felt like I had kind of entrapped myself for various reasons. And writing for me has always been, and I think will always be, first and foremost about freedom, really, how our ability to exercise it and to become more and than we are, and experiment with other lives and other voices and add dimension to our being, which all of you as readers, even if you're not writers, do every time you open a book. So I wanted to find that freedom again, and I sat down and in a very backwards way, without any sort of education or MFA or what have you, decided to write a novel. And I thought in order to write one, that one had to have an idea and go from there. So I came up with an idea, and it was about a man who had lost most of his memory of who he was. And I went on to write it. And then for a long time, I didn't look back, because what I discovered in writing that first novel was that the form of the novel was absolutely glorious, that it fit me better than I could have ever imagined. And I think that has something to do with the fact that novels are, they're so poorly defined, right? We can't really say what a novel is, other than the fact that it's a very long story with a beginning and end of a certain number of words. But anyone who's ever tried to define the form sort of fails spectacularly. And the only way to define a novel is by looking at the one you're reading or by writing one. But the flip side of that is that every time you write a novel, you're invited to redefine in your own terms what the form is and what it can do. And I found that spectacularly exciting. And so the years passed, and I wrote a second novel and a third novel and a fourth. And I will probably go on, I hope, writing novels all my life, because there's no end to that excitement, and there's no end to the largeness and freedom and the joy of the imperfection of a novel. You know, there's no perfect novel that's ever been written. They're beautiful, wonderful, affecting novels. They're extraordinary original novels, but a novel can't be perfect. Nothing can be perfect if we don't know what the ideal of the form is. And I find that very liberating. So the story, on the other hand, a story, of course, often takes less of your life. My novels have sometimes taken many, many years of my life, and a lot of emotional and intellectual and all kinds of energy expended on the project of writing a novel. And a short story, though it's demanding, it's a smaller venture, less time, let's say, and just in the most simplistic way. And because it's a smaller venture, you can take risks with it, maybe, that if the story doesn't work out and the weeks or month or whatever that you spent working on it end up being a failure, like, it's not years of your life. So there's a way in which short stories allow for this kind of playfulness, or the pursuit of characters or ideas, or forms of putting ideas and images or narratives together that I might not try in a novel. I might not want to, or maybe the character is such that I wouldn't want to live with her or him for 3 years, that it would take me to write a novel. Whatever the case, a lot of these bits and pieces started as their life as files on my computer. I generate a lot of material when I'm starting a novel, or just always I'm thinking about characters and voices, and a lot of them die almost immediately. But some of those files, some of those characters or voices or narrative threads are so alive that I can't, they never die. They sort of stay open in my mind. And most of the stories in this book started that way, with just a situation or a person that stayed alive. And maybe it took me a few months to write them. In some cases, I left them for years, wrote Forest Dark, and then returned to them in the years afterwards and finished the story. So let's see, there's lots of, I'm going to also read to you when I stop talking in a few minutes. But there's lots of stories in here about many, many things. The title obviously suggests that this is a book that's about being a man. It's not as obvious from that title. This is very much a book about being a woman as well. So 7 out of these 10 stories are narrated by women. And I think you can't ask the question of what it is to be a man without also asking the question of what it is to be a woman. I have inhabited men and women equally in my life as a writer. So all of my books, after the first book, which is with a man protagonist, all of my books have been equally in male and female voices. And I'm interested in what both of those things are. And I'm interested in the relationship between men and women. This short story collection is filled with young women, older men, boys, grandparents, parents, children, people really at every stage in life. And most of them, like in every literary story, are in the midst of some sort of struggle to understand something, to decide something. I'm interested particularly in this book in what it is to stand at a threshold and have to make a decision. And the decision isn't clear, but one of those decisions that's kind of woven through many of these stories is, where do I fall, if I'm a character, where do I fall on the spectrum of human being between, on the one hand, needing stability, needing safety, needing to belong someplace and somewhere and to someone and in a relationship, and on the other end of that spectrum, having freedom to become, to explore, to evolve, having independence. And I think everyone falls at different places on that spectrum in their lives. And at times we need more stability and we need more belonging. And sometimes we need more freedom to become something we haven't yet become, and to explore things we haven't yet explored. And so a lot of these stories find characters on that threshold, trying to decide whether or not to stay in a relationship that maybe is more narrow than they would want, or doesn't allow them to be as large or as evolving as they want, or whether to go with all of the potential loss that might come with it, also with the gain of new, fresh experience. This book is also filled with people who are engaged in the effort of trying to define themselves, and very often, as we all are struggling with being defined by others. So there are young women, like in the first story, Switzerland. It's a story that takes place in Switzerland, in Geneva, and it's told by a narrator looking back on when she was 13, and she lives in a boarding house with two older 18-year-old girls. And it's about this narrator's watching of one of these older girls' relationship with a much older man. And it's a story about how a young woman attempts, somewhat dangerously, to insist on her own self-definition, to test the limits and reach of her own self-control and the limits and reach of her own power. And I think it's a story that is sort of flips on the head a narrative that we often hear about, which is of young women, particularly young women in exploring their sexuality, that we often hear a narrative of those women sort of being taken advantage of or becoming victims. And this is very much a different kind of story, even if it has all of the same dangers, of a young woman, at least as she's seen by the narrator, attempting to, in the arena of a romantic or sexual relationship, to define herself. So these stories, there are many examples of self-definition in here, or the struggle for it. I want to read to you from the title story, which in some senses is the most complex structurally. Like all of my novels are polyphonic, so there are many different voices. And I like doing that because I can create echoes and meaning between the voices, right? So it's a much more subtle way of creating patterns in the reader's mind without telling you things directly. I can juxtapose stories or voices or metaphors or ideas. And in a short story, that's much harder to do. But in this one story, To Be a Man, I did try to do that. And so it has 4 parts. And it's essentially told by a woman who's in her 40s. And she's looking out over all of her lifelong experiences with men. And so it's really about looking at men. The first section is about her father. The second section is about a lover of hers who she refers to as the German boxer. The third part is about her friend Rafi, who is an Israeli, who is a dancer, but of course, as you all know better than anyone, like all Israelis, was in the army. And that section is about a story that happened to him when he was in Lebanon, and about his marriage now. And the final section, called Childhood, is about these narrators' children, who are adolescent boys, kind of on the cusp of manhood. And I was interested in that story, as I'm always interested in everything that I write, in the way that people can't be reduced, in the paradox and contradictions that exist in all of us, and the inability to resolve them, but we just simply have to learn to live with them. And I think that literature is a really wonderful lens with which to explore those things. Literature allows us to look at ambiguity, to look at uncertainty without having to quickly resolve it one way or another. It allows us to sit with it. And so this narrator is not trying to say this is what a man is or this is what I think of men. She's simply looking over these relationships and trying to hold up to the light with some great amount of tenderness the various paradoxes she's seen in these people and these people she loves or she close to her, and in also the paradoxes of what's being asked of them as boys, as men, as lovers, as fathers. So how much time do I have left? I'm just going to figure out how much I'm going to read to you. How much time do I have left?
5 minutes, I guess.
5 minutes. Okay. So I'm just going to read to you from the very end of this. I was going to read you 2 sections, but I think I'll just read you 1, and that way we'll leave more time for your questions. So this is from the very end of the story, childhood, and she's driving back. She and this friend Rafi have taken their boys. They each of their friends, or they each have these 2 boys, and so there are these 4 boys in the back seat, and Rafi has just told her this extraordinary story about Lebanon, and now she's kind of back in her mind thinking about her boys. Okay. My store of knowledge about them seems to me the closest I've ever come to possessing something infinite, and only a small part of it can find a foothold in language. And that's part of what is asked of us, isn't it? To be a witness, to be able to recount our children's stories from the very beginning. Exactly when and where they were conceived, how the older favored the right side of the womb and showed little interest in the left, and punched against my belly skin from the inside with a knee or fist. How the younger came into the world with a furrowed, philosophical look, a slight skepticism almost, but a willingness to be convinced, and a downy fur on his shoulders that later fell out. I've told them the stories of their births many times, but at some point something shifted. They began to insist on making me the hero of these tales rather than them. Now what they want to hear about is how hard I needed to work to push them out, how I refused any pain medication because I wanted to be able to stand and walk and writhe, however necessary to help them through the birth passage. They want to hear again how great the pain was, which I had prevailed over. Can I describe it? To what could it be compared? What they like, it seems to me, is to hear what an act of terrible strength it took to push them into the world, and that I, their mother, was capable of it. Or maybe what they want is to celebrate again the old and fading order of things, where they are not called on to protect, but are themselves watched over and protected. Enormous at birth, both are now so slender that their rib cages are visible under their skin when they lift their shirts over their heads. I know everything about what is visible of their bone structures beneath the skin and about the skin itself, the precise location of each beauty mark and when it arrived, and the scars and what caused them. I know in what direction the hair on their heads grows and the way they smell at night and in the morning, and all the many faces they went through before the ones they each wear now. Naturally, I do. When the older one worries that he is too thin and weak, I tell him how my brother had been built the same way when he was young, until, without warning, like a storm comes so suddenly that someone somewhere must have prayed for it. A change came over him, that the thinness is in their genes, the sticks for arms, the narrow waist and ribs poking out, all of it written into their bodies like an ancient story, but that sooner or later the time will come when this smallness and thinness will be overwritten, subsumed by mass, and the boys they are now will disappear, buried inside the men they will become. Your brother, he asks, trying to imagine it. My brother, who he once, but only once, saw in a moment of fury he failed to contain, pushed me across the room and threatened me with a fist. The small one is still too young to long to fall in love. He is surrounded by love, and that's still enough for him. The older one has already begun to long for it, but his body hasn't yet caught up with him. About this, he can still joke with me. For now, desire and the workings of the body are still subjects for humor, But as the months pass, something has begun to loom behind it, larger and larger. He is waiting for the changes he sees overtaking his friends and worries they will never come to him, that he will never desire the way others do. It's like a switch friends who have boys tell me. One day it goes on, and after that, things are never the same. The door closes on one side and opens to another, and that's that. Another friend, a man, says that he had been a quiet reader all through childhood, and then between 1 month and the next, he began to throw chairs. This worries the older one, too, the possibility that he will no longer be who he has always been, that he will lose something of his sensitivity, so valued by everyone who loves him, that he will become capable of violence. When I go to kiss him goodnight, he curls his body into mine, and in a nervous voice tells me that he wants to remain a child, that he doesn't want anything to change. But already he is no longer a child. He is standing out on a bank between the shore and a sea that goes on, and the water, as they say, is rising.
That was great. That was great. Thank you so much. Okay, now it's time for questions, guys. So put them in the chat. I know that I see that Max got one already about whether he had to go to Poland for any research. And you said you did, but ask us about your poster behind you. So
Yes, this poster was purchased in Krakow at the. I actually had written most of the first draft of it by the time I went to Poland. I was working at the New York Post in their on their travel beat, which is a great job if you can get it. And I had a new editor who asked me, "Where do you want to go?" And I was like, "Poland." So I already knew that I was working on this, but I figured this would be a good way to do a little bit of a trip. The book was very much a fantasy. So, and Kreskel, the Shtetl doesn't really exist. So I didn't have to be so exact about it, but I thought it was very important to actually go over there and see what it really felt like, driving around the block a few times. So that's what I did. And I wrote a nice little travel piece about it while I was there as well. I went with my mother, who I think might be on this call, but I know that my mother and my aunt came with me, and we spent about a week in Poland.
That's great. Okay. A question for Nicole. When writing a novel, do you outline or do you just get on the road, letting the story take you wherever? What about the short story? Is the process different?
So I always say that I'm sure the last person that any other writer should try to learn from, because I have such a strange process, although I don't think I'm alone in this process either. I start without knowing anything about where I'm going. I don't have a story. I don't know who my characters are. I don't know why I'm writing what I'm writing. What happens is one of those files that I was telling you about, just something I was writing, a couple of pages, something happens in there in which the character or the story comes alive. I don't know how to describe it except that like the mortal life is blown into the character. And at that moment, the language just stands up and it takes on a kind of life of its own, but I know it's something that is not going to let go of me. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for moments of urgency or aliveness that attract me as a writer and that I want to follow. The reason I don't have a plan is because I want to discover, just like I want my readers to discover. Ideally, I want the novel to change me or the story to change me. I want to be moved. I'd like a revelation if possible, even a few. And so I can't know where I'm going. I wouldn't want to write it if I knew where I was going. It's never like the execution of an idea. And I say that's not an advisable way to write, just because, as you can imagine, I reach, there are lots of, especially early on in my writing career, I would reach dead ends, or I would cry my way through writing novels because I would never know if they would all work out and come together. But I do think ultimately I do it because it leads to for me, the most authentic writing. I feel like that it's important that I'm not leading you, the reader, along on a leash and trying to show you things, that you are with me and we are discovering things together. And of course, I am the author. I'm constantly editing and changing what I write as I go. I'm composing the music, but I don't have a message that I'm trying to tell you, or I'm not trying to bring you from A through Z through the stations of the cross, as it were. I'm just asking questions, and I'm asking you to enter into that asking with me. So, and as it's different for a short story, no. As I said, some of these short stories were started and I had no idea what to do with them, and years passed. I wrote a novel and I came back to them. So if any of you have read the collection already, like more than half, maybe 3/4 are like that. And I remember one of them, which is now called I Am Asleep But My Heart Is Awake. I started and it was just with me for years, and I couldn't figure that. It was just this idea of this woman whose father dies, and only after his death does she discover she's inherited his apartment in Tel Aviv, but she had no idea that he had an apartment in Tel Aviv. And so she goes there, in a sense, to mourn him. And the moment she walks into the apartment, she feels like this is where he must have really lived. Like this is the most authentic place of his being, which is a discovery that we often have about our parents, like rooms, metaphorical rooms of them that we as their children never knew about. And she's only there a few days, and the stranger comes in the door. And the stranger has a key, and he seems to know his way around, and she can't figure out who he is. And I couldn't figure out who he was for years. And I think I even sent the story to Edgar Carrot and said, like, can you figure out the end of this? Because I have no idea how this should end. And he didn't know how it should end, because nobody can ever know how something can end except the person who's writing it. And then I wrote a novel and came back, and then I understood a little more what I was trying to write about, and about the process of grief and mourning, and about intimacy between strangers, and the story found its end. But I certainly didn't know it, as I never know at the beginning.
Okay. We have a lot of questions. Also in the chat, a lot of praise for The History of Love is my all-time favorite book. Someone else wrote, I agree. So here's a question from Ellie. Nicole, you've written a lot about Jerusalem, and actually in this collection, a bit about Tel Aviv as well. Do places have specific metaphors, rhythms, cadences? How does Jerusalem, or I'll broaden the question to, how does Israel resonate with you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, my last novel, Far Stark, is set mostly in Israel, and much of that in Tel Aviv, and then out in the desert. And this collection of stories very often goes to Tel Aviv and back, but also goes to Japan and South America and Switzerland. I think, as the child of grandparents who came from 4 different places in Europe and all had to leave because of the Holocaust, I've always been somebody, and my mom grew up in London, my dad grew up in New York and Tel Aviv, but I've just always been somebody who was never from one place. I've always wondered what that would be like, to be one of those families in Europe born into like 500 years of family history all in the same house, because it's totally an incomprehensible idea to me, as it is, I'm sure, to all of you. And I've always had the sense that I've had to create my world, my home, in my own writing. Like, Bellow, To Return to Him, talks about language as the writer's homeland. And I've really always felt that language is my homeland, but that the novel or the short story or my writing allows me to build a home, literally a structure that I can inhabit, that feels most like a place that I belong, and I hope others will feel they belong too. And so that place, necessarily, because I am made up of so many places, that place has to be made up of many. And I guess in my family history, Israel was the one constant in all of that ever-moving geography. So my grandparents met in Nahalal in the 30s, and my other grandparents made Aliyah and lived in Jerusalem for 25 years. And my parents met in Jerusalem in the Knesset and got married in the Tel Aviv Hilton. And my brother lives there now with his kids. And it's just always been the place, it's always been the one place that we've always gone back to, like to fall in love or have kids or get married or die, or all of those important things. And I think for me, it offers, inhabiting both New York and Israel allows me the chance to have different kinds of like cultures that are interesting to me as a writer. So I won't go on too long because I know there's a lot of questions, but just to make the point, like I wouldn't want to give up all that we have in America with, for example, the notion of self-invention, right? America absolutely is based on the idea that you can invent yourself. And I think that as a writer, that's true. Like language is generative. We can create who we are. We can expand our narrative. But there's not the same sense of history. And I love going to Israel, and there's this like 3,000 years of history that's informing everything, even while there's a country that's in the midst of inventing itself. I love the heat and the surreality of society and culture in Israel, which is very different than some of the conventions you find in America. So I like to have both, and I like to have people going back and forth between both. As I was saying earlier, writing is always about freedom, right? So I'm always looking for having more options, more places to go, more ways of being rather than less.
Great, thanks. Okay, Max, a question for you. How are you affected by your visit to Poland? Did you manage to interact with local people? Did your viewpoint change, and were your perceptions challenged? And someone else asked me a separate question, which cities you saw in Poland?
Well, I have to disappoint everybody and say that I probably was there for too brief a period to get more than a superficial look. It was 5 days. That's not, or 7 days, or whatever it was. So I didn't get as much of a look around as I wanted. I have spent a lot of time reading about Poland, though. And I have a lot of friends who have spent time there, and some who are themselves Polish. And I have a friend who I would constantly be emailing questions about Poland to over the course of my writing this, and just be like, what would be the term for blah blah blah, and he would get back to. He was very generous with his time. He's in the acknowledgments of the book. But this is one of the things about being a travel writer, is that you do get a kind of superficial look at some of these places. I definitely felt it was valuable. I definitely felt it was important. But I feel like reading, Poland, a history was, just as was more valuable. And keeping in touch, keeping up with all the events that are happening in Poland currently was pretty critical for me. Part of my process, I thought it was very interesting what you were saying just about how organically you work, just in terms of how the thing just sort of blooms and grows. I think that's probably true for a lot of writers. I think every writer has their own method, and it's not duplicable. But I think that to a certain extent, even though my book was very plot driven and story driven, there was so much that I wrote and then went back to check later. I was like, all right, well, I think that they're going to go here and do this and then this, and then, for credibility's sake, so much of it was fact checking after I had sort of imagined it, because I was sort of going with the flow, seeing where the story was taking me, which I think is what you were saying, just in terms of how it works for you. I think everybody's different about that, but I was probably doing something similar. I hope that answered the Poland question. I had a lot of Polish friends. I did ask them a lot of questions. I did visit Poland. It was a very important experience, but I can't say that it had. I don't think it had an unalterable effect on the book. I think it was important for the book, but it was a little bit short. I was mostly in Krakow and the surrounding area. I did visit Auschwitz while I was there. I went to there's a famous salt mine there that I don't know to look at. And Krakow itself is, is a very interesting, beautiful, preserved city that you see so much in. So it was a lot of fun spending a few days in Krakow.
Great. Yeah, I was going to ask if you had been on one of the like March of the Living trips prior to your trip for the post.
Sadly, no.
Okay, there's a question here for Nicole. I'm interested in the importance to you of exploring or using Jewish characters, that sort of specificity to eliminate the general.
Right. Well, I think, we don't have a lot of choice about the material that we're born into as writers. And, it's funny, I remember now being a really young writer, like in high school, and I did this summer workshop or something like that. And there was this one teacher who I kept making things up, like extraordinary things, like stories that took place in the South of the United States where I'd never been and things like that. And he kept saying to me, you really, really, really have to write from what you know. And I always resisted that. And I found that too confining. Maybe there's a theme you're noticing here about confinement and freedom, or at least I am. And part of me still resists the idea that I can't invent everything. But I have learned as time has passed and I've grown a little bit older and wiser that it was an enormous gift to be born into a Jewish life and a Jewish family and Jewish culture and 3,000 years of Jewish history and memory and Jewish text, that it gives me, knowing my material, knowing that corner of human being, as well as we all know our own corners of human being, gives me the only chance I really have to get to the universal. Having said that, there's something particular that I've noticed over time about Jewish thinking that I find extremely literary, or just that aligns itself really, really beautifully with novelistic thinking. And that's this kind of insistence that we're taught in Jewish text on doubt, right? And on the importance of sustaining uncertainty. So there's that idea in Mishnah and Talmud, and that you always want to keep the argument alive, right? That it actually, to resolve an argument is considered a kind of failure, that you want to keep the question open. And I think that pursuit of doubt and that pursuit of wrestling is really something very, very literary as well. And when the two of them go together, it kind of is, there's something extraordinary that often happens. Like I think of the work of Philip Roth, who wasn't textually, he wasn't that interested in Jewish texts, but he took from that whole way of being a kind of lifelong wrestling that's profoundly Jewish. So I guess I just find that, to me, it's just a richness and a pleasure, and it's and there's sort of no end to it. And every time I think that I might have reached the end, something else happens. Just for example, in one of his stories in this book, there's a young woman whose parents have decided to get divorced very amicably, and it comes as a complete surprise to her. And her father is an archaeologist, and because he's Jewish, I could make him an archaeologist at Megiddo. And because he was a Jewish archaeologist at Megiddo, I could go back to all kinds of fascinating ideas that could then underlie a story about a modern day contemporary woman in a world in Los Angeles in which there are wildfires, and about old ancient orders being replaced by new orders. And so there's this way in which just the introduction of a little bit of a Jewish past or a Jewish history can open the possibility for thematic meaning that's, for me, extremely rich.
By the way, Nicole, I wrote a lot of stories about the South when I was a kid too. So Civil War was very big.
Further, yeah, I didn't even want to say what I was writing. I just said the absurdity of it. So I don't know what we have in common there. Maybe that even in itself is Jewish.
Well, I think you're totally right that like the Jewish, because Jews pop up everywhere, all over the world, we're extremely adaptable as a story source. Like, we can constantly, because we're the Zelig of history, just in the sense that we're everywhere. And so, you could sort of get us you could shoehorn us in anywhere almost.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I totally agree with what you were saying, Nicole, about the richness of our heritage and the rich. There's so much we can pull from, uh, whether it's history or the text. Text. I mean, it's endless, as you say. Um, okay, I have a question for both of you. How do you feel that your process of writing helps you grow as a person, and that do you feel that your act of creating is a part of your journey?
I feel like it's so central to who I've always thought of myself, that it's a little bit difficult to discuss because I've always thought of myself as a writer, and I always, viewed that as, even almost before I was Jewish or anything else, I thought of myself that way. And I mean, there's I think that I am not a great speaker. I think I'm not talented in so many things. But when I'm really writing, when I'm really, locked in on a story or a passage, there's nothing in life that makes me as happy. I'm fully myself at that moment. And so sure, it's a kind of therapy almost, if you will. This is where I really sort of work out all of my thoughts and feelings. And so I feel like that's all the growth I've done. I don't know how mature or well grown I am, but all the growth that I have done has been, not all of it, but most of it has been as a writer. So it's a great tonic.
It's interesting. I've thought a lot about this all my life as a writer, but people talk about writing very often as self-expression. Like, you think about when our kids go to school and they're like, they should write, so they learn to express themselves. And of course that's true in a way, but it just sort of gets at one dimension of writing, and it's really the thinnest dimension of writing, because anyone who has taken a pen to page, which is I'm sure all of you, finds out as soon as they start to write that actually writing is much more than that. It's about self-invention, right? It's about expanding your sense of self. So, when I started when I was 14, that's very often the age when people start to write, because it's also the moment that we're entering into this this genesis of self, right? Where we're moving away from our parents and beginning to define ourselves on our own terms. And you realize when you have this blank page or your blank computer screen, as you start to write and you try on voices and you from the South but whatever you are, that you can become all of these things. And in the process of becoming them, they really do kind of become part of your being. Like you're adding these dimensions of selfhood and self-expansion. And I think that this is the deepest part of the literary process. Like, whether you are reading or whether you're writing, you're adding dimension to who you are, right? The characters that you love, whether you've written them or not, they become part of your being, and they've added to your sense of the world and of yourself. And so there's this enormous possibility in the realm of writing. And I think the thing that I found myself thinking about a lot, particularly when I was writing For a Start, this idea became central, was that, when you write and when you read, you realize this expansiveness of the narrative of self. And then when you're outside of literature and you go and do your shopping at Whole Foods or the AM PM or wherever you go in Israel, and you pick up your kids from school and the gun, and then you're just forget all of that possibility for widening the story of who you are. And we return to this much more narrow story, right? And that's a story that started being told about who we are, like by our parents. Like, you are like this, your sister's like this, and your brother's like this, and you're like this. And that story, which is at some point becomes very, very, very limiting, and it doesn't fit who we are. And so I've always wondered, how can we use what we know from literature to expand that narrative of self, which is the narrative that we are living every day, right? That's how the brain works. It tells us a story of who we are, and the brain needs coherence more than it needs an accurate account of reality. So every self is a fictional story, is a narrative. So that interests me, and I think that, you know, I'm always thinking about that in my work. I have, you know, it goes out saying that I have found writing to be enormously expansive, in my own narrative of who I am. And I guess just to finish up, I'd also say one other idea that maybe will speak to some of you, which is that, you know, in this world, the one we're inhabiting right now, like this reality, it's very often hard, challenging to create meaning, beauty, sense. Like we try all the time, but it's hard because like we have a million things to do and life is banal and hard. But in the space of writing or reading, there's this parallel world where there is coherence and there is beauty and sense is possible and the construction of meaning is possible. And the thing about inhabiting that parallel world is that when the book is over, it's not that you can't stay in the world of literature, but you can smuggle home with you back to this reality all kinds of ideas and all kinds of meanings that then we apply to who we are and how we want to live and who we want to be and how we want to treat other people and how we see other people. And I think that has been a lifelong process for me that's been like more valuable than nearly anything else.
I totally agree with everything that both of you said. I find that I write to figure out what I think, and I might not realize what it is until much later. You know, my first goal when I'm trying to write a story is to come up with interesting characters and you know, a beautiful setting and a plot that's you know, a narrative that's interesting. But then afterwards, like when my book came out and I was being interviewed and people were asking me, you know, what's the takeaway? And I had to go back and think, you know, what's the takeaway and what did I want the takeaway to be? And it was still this revelatory process for me of oh, you know, this is what I think you know, the takeaway kind of is. And I didn't realize it as I was writing, but yeah, I guess this is what I think. So I love what you were saying about it being, you know, a way of expanding yourself and figuring out what you think. Okay, we're kind of over time, but I'll ask two last questions. How do you get your inspiration? So, Nicole, why don't you take that one?
Oh, okay. I don't really know what inspiration is. I always feel like inspiration is something that other people might know about, but I don't know what that is. I just know about like willfully dragging myself to my desk every day and trying to get words on a page, but I never feel, okay, let me put it differently. I don't feel, because of the way that I write and because it's very intuitive and improvisatory, as I described, I don't feel I have something that comes to me in advance of writing. I feel like what happens is while I'm on the page, and in the work, something happens that I guess is kind of magical. Like it certainly is a mystery to me. And it's worth just pausing on that idea because very often writers have to appear before readers or journalists and answer what their books are about and why they do what they do. And it discounts the fact that so much of writing is mysterious. The process is mysterious and why things come to us and when they do. And that I think it's important to respect that. So if that's what you mean by inspiration, that I understand, but I don't know when it happens and why. I know that I've learned more and more as a writer how to tell when a good accident happens on the page. So obviously writing the way that I write and Max writes, accidents happen on the page, you don't know why you did. And a lot of those accidents are not good. And so you delete them or pass them over, or those files get lost in your computer. But sometimes a really good accident happens and you realize that it's a door that's been open for you and you just have to figure out how to go through it. And again, it's not inspiration in terms of like an idea comes fully formed, but it's just the magic of getting absorbed into something that you didn't know was going to happen and that you didn't know was important, but takes you someplace. And those are the accidents or like the portals that I'm always looking for in the daily grind of writing.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with that. I mean, you know, I think that, you know, so much of, I mean, look, I'm a big believer that it's a very mysterious process, and I don't know why an idea pops into my head. I could tell you where the idea for the Lost Shtetl popped into my head. I was reading a book of history called The War Against the Jews, which was a book about the Holocaust. And a very perverse thought occurred to me. It was a very data-heavy book, and a thought occurred to me: how did the Nazis? How are they so efficient just in this horrible, like, in the Holocaust? Like, how is it that not one single of the hundreds of shtetls that were in, like, Eastern Europe, why did none of them escape? And just a little bulb went off, and I was like, oh, well, what if one did? And that was, sort of where the inspiration for this particular book came from. But it was still, that was a very small seed. Like, it would take a really long time before, like, characters and a story and all these other things would be filled in. And I'm a very big believer in something that you said, Nicole, which was just, I think, it has to be treated with a certain amount of perspiration, like sitting at your, desk and, like, focusing on it and just making sure that you are thinking about it deeply. I think if you are a talented writer, or you're a smart person, if you continue to think about it, you will, figure things out, and you have some of these accidents that I think you were talking about. And I think that, accidents are, I love the using the term accidents, because I think there are so many happy accidents that happen in art. But so that's my answer, if that is an answer. I don't know.
I love that, the accidents and the way that you can, the portals opening a door. Yeah, that's happened to me also. Just, wow, why didn't I think of that before? Sitting with a story and revising it for 4 years and thinking it was done several times, and then after 4 years, like the perfect ending popped into my head, and I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. But sometimes you just have to sit with the story, I think, for those accidents to happen. So last question. This one is for Nicole, because you can kind of settle a question some of my friends that I've been having about your book cover. Is this meant to be to a man and a woman, or two women? It's very unclear. Or is it meant to be just vague?
Great. I'm going to hold the whole thing up so those people who can't see it. There it is. I designed this book cover, I will tell you, because nobody could come up with one that worked. And so at the last minute, I found this photo, and I was thinking of this wonderful Godard film with those primary colors, anyway, a black and white movie. So it was done like that in an instant. But I think it works, and it is actually a man and a woman. And in fact, we had to. You see her neckline? So earlier it was cropped a little too much, and without that, it looks more like two men, but with that, to me. But I knew that everyone was going to ask this question, because I had shown it to a lot of people, and people wondered whether it was two men, two women. This is not a book that the title suggests that it could somehow be about gender in ways that it isn't at all. But the thing that I liked the most about this was this in between, this figure. You see this person, the shape of this person in between these two mouths. And I like the fact that created a figure, that a man and a woman together created this figure, a human looking figure. I like the fact that they could be about to argue. They could be about to kiss each other. I liked everything about what was poised to happen there. And I like the fact that you wouldn't know and that you would ask those questions. At the end of the day, I think a cover is only useful enough for to catch your eye and get you to open the book.
It is very interesting. Yeah, it makes you stop and think. So. Yeah. Okay, I want to thank everybody who's come to this event, and I really want to thank Max and Nicole. It was great to listen to you guys and to hear your insights and writing, and to hear you reading from your work. It was beautiful. PSA, for everybody who's listening, it's really important to get reviews. So please write reviews of their books, or any book that you like. It really helps the author. So please do that. And if you missed part of the, quite a few people were coming in had to come late or had to leave early, but I'll be sending out a recording of the whole thing tomorrow, as well as some links as to where you can purchase the book if you don't have books, if you don't already have them. So thank you again, everyone. And this was great. Looking forward to the next one, whenever that may be, probably end of January, beginning of February.
Thank you.